because of their pregnancy or pregnancies. Your mother may have had complications and pains that were so serious that they had to be put on bed rest and maybe even had to quit their jobs to safely bring you to full term. My wife was put on bed rest during one of our pregnancies. We binge watched more shows that pregnancy than I've ever watched in my entire life because there was nothing to do. And so we laid there while she was on bed rest, but it was difficult. Your mother may have had severe pain if they delivered you naturally. I was not allowed to take any pictures while my wife was in labor. I don't know about you guys. I don't think you'd want to see those pictures. I almost got kicked out of the room, pretty sure. I had a cold during one of the pregnancies, and so I was just constantly blowing my nose and stiffing. And I was threatened to be kicked out of the room while she was trying to, work on her counting and things like that. And so, but all smiles once the baby was born and things were better. Your mother may have had pain in recovery if they delivered you via C-section. It took longer to recover, and they still have scars from that. Some moms hardly ever recover from the body changes that take place during a pregnancy and the busyness of child rearing that follows. So before our mothers ever held us in their arms, we've got to take a moment to appreciate what they endured just to bring us into the world. They likely cried at some point during the pregnancy, during the childbirth, during the recovery. So even before you were born, your mother was enduring pain, shedding tears and in agony so that she could carry you to term. Chances are your moms have reminded you of the pains that they went through to raise you at some point. Has your mom ever reminded you of that? I'm the one who carried you. I'm the one who gave birth to you. I'm the one who diapered you, and I'm the one who fed you and nursed you, and you need to listen to me and respect me. Look at Hosea chapter 11. I want you to actually see in the book of Hosea how some of this seems to take place as God tries to remind his people of what it's like to be their father. In chapter 11 and verse 1, it says, "When Israel was a child, I loved him." When Israel was a child, I loved him. And what the Lord is trying to do through Hosea here, he's trying to make a parallel to how the Lord had carried Israel and birthed the nation, if you will, and tried to help the nation through its difficult times, just like a mother or father who cares for their children. He goes on to say, look at verse 3, "I taught Ephraim," that'd be the northern kingdom, "but I taught Ephraim to walk, taking them by their arms, but they did not know that I healed them." Can you consider the picture here? It's like God the Father is trying to get us to picture a father or a mother who's behind their child, holding on their little hands or holding on to their fingers, and they're teaching them how to walk. God is trying to express to Israel how he sacrificially and lovingly has cared for his people. He says in verse 4, "I drew them with gentle cords, with bands of love, and I was to them as those who take the yoke from their neck." So we've got a different comparison being made here. But skip on down to verse 7 and notice the disappointment of God. Because his people are an idolatrous people, a rebellious people. And he says, "My people are bent on backsliding from me. Though they call to the Most High, none at all exalt him." It's the picture here of a father or of a parent who's deeply hurt because they remember what they have tried to endure to bring Israel to maturity, and yet they're being rejected. And in all of this, notice verse 8, "But how can I give you up, Ephraim? You are my child. You are my nation. I love you," is the idea. "And I can't give you up. I'm still trying to bring you to repentance. How can I give you up, Ephraim? How can I hand you over, Israel? How can I make you like Admah? And how can I make you like Zeboim?" These are cities that were destroyed. And what God is saying is, I don't want to destroy you like I did those other cities because I've birthed you. I've raised you. And so even God is using this picture, this comparison to remind Israel of how much he loves them here in Hosea chapter 11. Well, So one of the things that makes moms cry is the pain of childbirth. Well, let's move over a chapter. So Genesis 3, we have the pain of childbirth being introduced in the curse. But I want you to notice a second point, a second thing that makes your mothers mourn. And that is when we see our children become rivals. You go a chapter further and you have another moment when Eve, the mother, the first mother of all that are living, when she mourns. She had to deal with the unfortunate pain of two brothers who were at war. And of course, we know who those are. In Genesis chapter 4, that'd be Cain, and that would be Abel. After the Garden of Eden, I think we know what Cain and Abel did, right? Cain and Abel both offer an offering. Abel's offering is accepted by God. Cain's offering is rejected. This makes Cain jealous and angry at his brother. And so Cain kills his brother Abel as they go to war in the field. And we don't see much from Eve in terms of her response or what she did in this moment. But you can imagine, as parents or just as human beings, you can imagine the pain and the hurt and the grief that Eve must experience. But we only see two little hints of how Eve felt about it here in Genesis 4. I want you to notice just the two quotations that you have from Eve in Genesis chapter 4. The first one is in Genesis 4 and verse 1. This is when her firstborn child is born, and her firstborn child would have been Cain. And notice the excitement, it would seem, in Eve's voice in Genesis 4, verse 1. She names him Cain, and she says this, "I have acquired a man from the Lord." Can you sense the excitement? I'm happy. I have a child. I have a boy. His name's going to be Cain. And then we have Abel being born after that as well. What disappointment she must have had when this firstborn son that she was so excited about takes the life of their second child, Abel. And the next time that we see Eve speak, it's at the birth of Seth. That's their third boy, or at least they had other daughters and sons we also see in the text, but it's the third one who's named that we see in the Genesis text. But notice Genesis chapter 4 and verse 25, what she says there. It says, "For God," she names him Seth, and she says this, "For God has appointed another seed for me instead of Abel, whom Cain killed." She references the murder of her son as the birth of this next son comes to light. Can you sense the mourning in this memory? Even in the naming of her child, she's reminiscent of the death of her child. So what pain it must have brought for Eve to see her boys at war with one another in the field, and her firstborn son, Cain, cursed to be a fugitive. Now, I want to make a point about that, because I'll tell you something. As children, if you've got brothers and sisters and you are at war with those brothers and sisters in your family, it brings your mother and your father great pain, not to mention God. Sibling rivalry is constantly referred to as you walk through the book of Genesis. It brings disappointment to mothers and fathers. It was witnessed in the lives of Jacob and Esau. Jacob has to flee because he's afraid when he takes the birthright and the blessing, he's afraid that Esau's going to kill him. And these brothers are estranged for a long period of time from one another. And actually, through the bloodlines, they are constantly at war throughout the history of the Edomites and then the people of Israel. Sibling rivalry was witnessed among the sons of Joseph, and Jacob can only find relief years later when the sons are providentially reunited. And so because of Jacob's favoritism towards Joseph, the other brothers are jealous of Joseph, also because of Joseph's dreams, which they find to be arrogant and self-willed. There's sibling rivalry that exists in that family. And because of that sibling rivalry, it ultimately leads to them selling Joseph into slavery, Joseph being gone for years while Jacob thinks he's been dead the entire time, and he mournfully grieves over the loss of his son. Children at war with one another is one of the most painful aspects of parenting, and yet it is far too common in many families. Sometimes, I'll say this, in matters of faith, children do have to take a stand against one another for the cause of truth. Matthew chapter 10 teaches us that we have to stand with Jesus in the cross, even if that means the division of mother and father and brother and sister and son and daughter. We have to stand with Jesus first and foremost. But oftentimes, the factors that have caused conflict and estrangement and family war, those are issues that continue because of unresolved anger, things that could be resolved, but we refuse to resolve them. And so we have to remind ourselves of what Jesus taught in those moments about reconciling with one another in passages like Matthew 5 and verse 21. Verse 21, it says, you've heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder. That's what Cain did to Abel when he got angry. But we're not supposed to murder. It says in verse 22, whoever is angry with his brother without a cause. Cain didn't really have a good reason to be angry other than his own jealousy and envy of God's approval of his brother over him. Whoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. Whoever says to his brother, Raka, which means, which is an insult, it shall be in danger of the council. Whoever says, you fool, shall be in danger of hellfire. So he's talking about, here's things that happen when we don't like each other. We start calling each other names and we start insulting each other and trying to hurt each other through our words as an indication of our hatred. And so verse 23 says, if you bring your gift to the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go your way and be reconciled to your brother and then come and offer your gift. Maybe we could say something similar about a holiday like today. If you really want to make your mom and your dad happy, do what you can to fix things with your siblings before you come and you bring your gift to their feet. Because there's nothing that a parent wants to see more than their children getting along with one another and loving each other. Verse 25 says, agree with your adversary quickly. Just the idea is reconcile. Do what you can, whatever is within your power to reconcile. We know that there's two sides to reconciliation. It takes two parties for that to be able to happen. But if there is something that can be done so that you can reconcile your relationships, Matthew 5 encourages us to do that. Look at Luke chapter 12, and I want you to see a little moment of sibling rivalry that exists in Luke chapter 12, verses 13 and 14. And sometimes it has to do with the inheritance. You know, it's funny, our kids, when they're little, they're fighting over toys, right? Sometimes kids never grow up. It's just that when we get older, we're fighting over the inheritance. And we're mad about possessions and things and who got left out and who got this and who got that. And that's what's happening in Luke chapter 12, verses 13 and 14. One from the crowd said to him, okay, Jesus is mid-sermon, and somebody speaks up and says, teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. And one of the responses of Jesus, I think, is instructive for us. He says, man, who made me a judge or an arbitrator over you? I like that Jesus does not get involved in every petty dispute that exists between people. You sort that out. But Jesus does make this point. He says, beware of covetousness. What's at the root of this problem, really? I'm not going to tell you how your parents should have distributed the inheritance and how much of it should be divided with you. I'm not going to do that, but I'm going to tell you, you should be careful about the danger of covetousness, because that's really what this problem is. One kid wants one toy, really, that's the beginnings of covetousness when they're children. One adult child wants more of the inheritance over the other. That's just the fruits of covetousness as they get older. Sometimes those types of things are the things that are causing conflict in families, and some children never quit fighting over their toys. If Cain and Abel teach us anything, it's the importance of siblings looking out for one another in this life and loving each other. The question is asked in Genesis chapter 4 by Cain, am I my brother's keeper? Of course, we know the answer to that question, right? Yeah, you are. And you should be. You should be taking care of your brother. You should be protective of him. That should be your attitude towards your brother. And that idea is carried forth further in 1 John chapter 4, or 1 John chapter 3, I believe it is. If you look at 1 John chapter 3, John chooses to write about this even more. And he says this in verse 10, In this, the children of God and the children of the devil are manifest. Whoever does not practice righteousness is not of God, nor is he who does not love his brother. Now, we're talking about brothers in Christ here, but of course, the example that's used is as blood brothers of Cain and Abel in 1 John 3. In 1 John 3 and verse 11, John says, "This is the message that you heard from the beginning, that we should love one another." What did God want us to learn from Genesis chapter 4? That you shouldn't be rivals with one another, hating one another, jealous of one another, competing all the time. You should love one another. Verse 12 says, "Not as Cain. Don't act like him, who was of the wicked one and murdered his brother." And why did he murder him? Because his works were evil and his brothers were righteous. Sometimes that's why sibling rivalry exists, because one child is doing the will of God and the other child is not, and they become jealous of the other child who's doing the will of God and is approved because of those things. He says, be careful that you do not be like Cain. What you really should do in that circumstance is repent, change your life so that you might be pleasing to God, and you find both of you will be approved. Verse 13, "Do not marvel, my brethren, if the world hates you. We know that we have passed from death to life because we love the brethren." How do you know that you're truly saved, that you're truly walking in the will of God? When we love one another as brethren. But if you hate your brother, you're a murderer, and no murderer has eternal life abiding in him. God wants us to rejoice with one another and to love one another. It brings a mother great joy when her children can all spend time together in love and in unity rather than in hatred and in war. But how many mothers grieve today over children who are at war? So may we rejoice with one another rather than act with petty jealousy. This is true of our blood family. This is also true of the family that has been bought by the blood of Jesus Christ. Of us as a church, as a local church, of our brethren, that we need to be people who rejoice with one another when there's times to rejoice. And we try to live in peace and harmony and unity as brothers and sisters in Christ. Well, let me notice a third thing with you. A third moment when moms mourn is when we see our children suffer. At times, our children suffer because of the choices of their family. Let me turn with you to another Genesis passage, Genesis chapter 16. When we get to Genesis chapter 16, we come across the story of Hagar and Ishmael. Abram makes a poor choice, encouraged by his wife Sarah at that point. And that choice, because he hadn't yet had the child of promise, that choice was that he would decide to have a child with his maidservant, his Egyptian maidservant, Hagar. And that brings a lot of conflict to the family when that happens. Sarah's the one who encouraged it in the first place. And then when finally Hagar is with child, Sarah becomes pretty jealous of that situation and upset. She gets to the point, or at least Hagar gets to the point, because of how Sarah is treating her. And by the way, can you imagine this in a household? You're living with, Sarah's living with her husband, and her husband has impregnated another woman, and that woman is also living in the house. So can you imagine there might just be a little bit of conflict in the house in that situation? Sarah, being the rightful wife of Abram, is upset with how things have played out, and she's being harsh towards Hagar. In verse 8, Hagar leaves the presence of Sarah, and an angel comes to Hagar, Sarah's maid, and says, "Where have you come from and where are you going?" And I think what the simple thing we learn from that is that God notices. God notices when we've come through difficult circumstances, and God would ask us, "But where do you think you're going to go from here? What are you going to do with your difficult circumstances?" And she said, "I am fleeing from the presence of my mistress Sarah." In verse 9, the angel of the Lord said to her, "Return to your mistress and submit yourself under her hand." The angel wants her to continue in this relationship, at least for the time being. I want you to notice verse 13, because the angel makes some promises to her that she's going to have a child. This child is going to be named Ishmael. Ishmael is going to have an interesting future. But notice verse 13. Hagar calls the name of the Lord who spoke to her, "You are the God who sees. You are the God who sees." For she said, "Have I also here seen him who sees me?" One of the great comforts that Hagar takes while she is there in the wilderness, grieving, mournful over the situation that she's going to have to raise her child under a father who perhaps does not love Ishmael like he's going to love the true child of promise one day, and Sarah, the wife, who's going to treat her child harshly, and her child is going to have to see this for all of his days. She's grieving, she's mourning over that, but she's thankful that at least God sees the situation that she's in. And she's thankful for that. Now, turn to Genesis 21, and you actually see the moment where finally she is allowed, encouraged to leave the situation now that Ishmael is a few years older. And in Genesis chapter 21, you see that Sarah has now conceived. Sarah now has the child of promise, that's Isaac. And as you move on down, notice verse 9. Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, that's Ishmael, whom she had borne to Abraham, scoffing. So now Sarah's mad because this almost preteen boy, she's probably around 12 or 13 at this point, Ishmael, is making fun of the little baby Isaac, and Sarah does not take that well. She already does not like Hagar, and now she definitely doesn't like this little 12, 13-year-old brat that's making fun of her newborn child that she's very proud of. So at that point, she wants to kick Hagar out. Now imagine being Hagar. Her livelihood has been completely dependent upon Abraham, who's a rich man at this point, and now she's being kicked out to the wilderness, and she doesn't know where she's going to go, what she is going to do. How is she going to support her child out in the middle of this wilderness? And that's where we find her when we come across the rest of the text here. It says in verse 14, Abraham rose early in the morning, took bread and a skin of water, putting it on her shoulder. He gave it to the boy. He gave it and the boy to Hagar and sent her away. Here you go. Here's your Stanley thermos. And here's a loaf of bread. Good luck. So Hagar is thinking, well, where am I supposed to go? What am I supposed to do in this moment? In verse 15, it says, the water in the skin was used up. I'm out of all I had was this water, and it's used up. And she placed the boy under one of the shrubs. She's just going to leave him to die because she thinks that's what's going to happen. We're just going to die out here. She went and she sat down across from him at a distance of about a bow shot. She said to herself, let me not see the death of the boy. And she sat opposite him and lifted her voice and wept. And here she is mourning over her child because she has no idea, what am I going to do with this child now that I'm in this situation? And then the angel of God speaks to her again. The God who sees Hagar again. And God heard the voice of the lad. Verse 17 says, and the angel of God called to Hagar out of heaven and said to her, what ails you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the lad where he is. Arise and lift up the lad and hold him with your hand, for I am going to make him a great nation. And God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. And she went and filled the skin with water and gave the lad a drink. And there God supplies for her far more than Abraham ever gave her, and provides for her so that she can raise her child. Difficult circumstances, but God provides, and God sustains Hagar in those difficult moments. Now, in both cases, Genesis 16 and Genesis chapter 21, it was Abraham's stupidity and Sarah's jealousy that led to the suffering that Hagar and Ishmael would face as victims of the collateral damage. But it was the suffering of Hagar that led her in both cases to be encouraged and dependent upon the will of the God who sees. One of the things that we mourn for our children is when they become the collateral damage of choices that were not their own. Divorce and infidelity are the most common culprits of the secondary suffering that our family must face due to the sins of one or both partners. Malachi tells us that this is what's going to happen. When one person does not keep their covenant, one person does not keep their vow. Look at Malachi chapter 2, verse 13. It says, this is the second thing you do. God is bringing charges to his people. And he says, you cover the altar of the Lord with tears, with weeping and crying, and he doesn't regard your offering anymore, nor will he receive it with goodwill from your hands. And yet you say, for what reason? Because the Lord has been witness between you and the wife of your youth, with whom you have dealt treacherously, and yet she is your companion and she is your wife by covenant. Your wife deserves to be treated better than you're treating her. You are treating her treacherously, God says. What are going to be the consequences of that? Look at verse 16. The Lord hates divorce because it covers one's garment with violence, because there's collateral damage, because people get hurt. Your children, even your grandchildren, the people around you, they get hurt when marriages aren't what they're supposed to be. And it hurts us as moms and as dads to see our children suffer, sometimes as a result of one, sometimes both parents. And so we suffer as our children suffer in moments like that. So sometimes it's our choices, it's the parents' choices, it's other people's choices that lead to our children suffering. But let's also say this, sometimes our children suffer as a result of their own choices. And we suffer as parents as we watch those that we love so dearly slip further and further away from the Lord. You know, the two Hittite wives of Esau, when we read Genesis 26, verse 34, it says that they were a grief of mind to Isaac and Rebekah. Isaac and Rebekah knew that these Hittite women who had no respect for the Lord were going to be raising their grandchildren, and their grandchildren were going to be being pulled further away from the Lord. But that was the choice that Esau made. It made Rebekah, if you look at Genesis 27 and verse 46, Rebekah says, these women that my son have married, they're making me weary of my life. That's how she feels because of the choices that her son was making. It's almost like Rebekah saying, I raised him to make better choices than this, and he's not making the right choices. And she hurts because she sees the choices that he's making. In Proverbs chapter 31, I was thinking about preaching on Proverbs chapter 31 today, but chose to go a different route. But in Proverbs chapter 31, one of the things that you see in that last chapter of Proverbs is the encouragement of Lemuel's mother to find a woman whose worth is far above rubies, and that would be a virtuous woman. The most important decision that you are going to make in life, besides choosing to follow Jesus, is choosing who you are going to marry and who you are going to spend, if you get married, the rest of your days with. They will have the biggest influence upon you and upon your faith for the rest of your life. And so it's important that you choose wisely. Here, we find Esau not choosing wisely, but we're supposed to be learning from his mistakes. Your marriage choice is the most vital decision you'll make. It will impact your entire family, for better or for worse, for all the rest of your days. Many a mother has cried over the foolish marriage choice of her son, and many a father has grieved over the foolish relationship choices of his daughter. We need to choose wisely and who we're going to spend the rest of our life with. But it's not just who you marry, it's any choice you make, especially any sinful choice. When you choose sin and folly over righteousness and godliness, it hurts your parents. It hurts God, most importantly. But if you've got godly parents, it hurts them. Proverbs chapter 10 and verse 1 says that. It says, a wise son makes a glad father, but a foolish son is the grief of his mother. Do you see the mother crying? Why? Because their son has been foolish. How many mothers have grieved and cried because their child got taken to the principal's office? Their child's calling them from jail. Their child has made a huge mistake in their life, and it's cost them their family, and it's cost them the relationship that they have with their grandchildren. A wise son makes a glad father. A foolish son is the grief of his mother. She grieves over the foolishness of her son. Now, why does it bring grief? Because mothers don't want to raise their sons to be rebels. A godly child's sinfulness demonstrates a lack of respect for his upbringing if you've been raised in a godly home. And it grieves us that despite all of our efforts on our instruction, our children might go the other direction. Proverbs 15 and verse 20 says, a wise son makes a father glad. A foolish man despises his mother. Proverbs 15:20. A foolish man, you despise your mom. You're not listening to her good counsel. Proverbs 17:25 says, a foolish son is a grief to his father and bitterness to her who bore him. Even God goes back to the person who gave birth to you, carried you. It's an embarrassment to her when we act sinfully. It is hard to celebrate motherhood with children who are destined for hell. And so it hurts your mother and your father when you're rebelling against your godly upbringing. And you got to consider the heartache. There are people who I believe today is a difficult day for them. I know moms who have told me through the years, Mother's Day coming. And Mother's Day, a lot of times there's extra kids in the pews and sons and daughters. I remember one mom telling me though one time, she said, my kids ask me, what do you want for Mother's Day, Mom? And I always tell them the same thing. I just want you to sit next to me at church on Sunday. And she says, I say this every year, and I've never gotten them to come and sit next to me at church on Sunday. That's what she wants more than anything, is to know that her children, to somehow, hopefully you hear something that sparks a change in your heart, in your mind, in your will, so you might come back to the Lord. Because if your parents want anything for you, if they're godly parents, they care about your eternity more than anything. Forget the gifts, the money, the gift cards. They want your soul to belong to God. And so it causes us to suffer when our children suffer. Well, one last thing that I think we need to be mindful of, and that is sometimes, as moms and dads, we lose our children. We lose our children. Now, certainly that's true spiritually. We've just kind of talked about that. The previous point demonstrates the pain of losing our children to the sinful world as we see their choices. But the Bible is full of examples of women who mourn their children due to death. That's the last thing I think most mothers want to see. We want to go first. We don't want to experience the loss of a child, and yet many moms have, and that makes today difficult for some people. And that can make every day difficult, not just today, for moms. Take a look at a few examples. In the book of Ruth, this may be the one that's the most well-known in the Old Testament, but in the book of Ruth, we start off in the first 3 verses of Ruth, and we find a woman named Naomi who loses her husband, but she also loses her 2 boys as she's in the land of Moab. And then as you look at the latter part of Ruth chapter 1, you find that this woman, Naomi, says, I don't want to be called Naomi anymore. I want you to call me Mara. And that word Mara means bitter. And the reason she wants to be called bitter, can you imagine someone saying, please don't call me my positive name, Naomi. Please call me this name, bitter. She's clearly very depressed, very discouraged, very sad, but she wants to be called bitter because that's how she feels. She's lost her 2 boys, and she's hurt. I want you to look at another lesser-known example. Look at 2 Samuel chapter 21, where we read about a mother, and her name is Rizpah. Have you ever heard the story of Rizpah? In 2 Samuel chapter 21, we read about her. She's actually introduced to us in 2 Samuel chapter 3. Rizpah was one of Saul's concubines. So Saul has multiple sons. The one that we know the most well-known is Jonathan. And Saul, while fighting with Jonathan, as well as 2 of his other boys, Saul dies fighting the Philistines, and he loses 3 sons in that battle. But those weren't the only sons that Saul had. Saul had more sons than that. He had 2 sons by Rizpah, who was one of his concubines. Now, what does a concubine do when her caregiver, the king, is no longer alive? 3 of his sons have also died. What does she do? Well, what Rizpah does is she becomes the concubine of Ishbosheth, who is another one of Saul's sons, who declares himself the king. Now, we know David was the real king that God had appointed, but Ishbosheth, for a very short time, declared himself to be the king. And Ishbosheth we're not sure if this is a false accusation or a real accusation, but Ishbosheth gets upset with his commander in 2 Samuel chapter 3, and that's Abner. And he accuses Abner. He says, have you been sleeping with Rizpah, my concubine? And if that was happening, that would be Abner trying to declare the throne. There would be perhaps keenly complications with that. But it seems like it's a false accusation. But Rizpah's the one who's in the middle of all this, just basically being accused of, now she's with Ishbosheth, was sleeping around with different men. And that's all that we see about her in 2 Samuel chapter 3. But you find her in 2 Samuel chapter 21. And let me kind of retell the story a little bit to try to put everything together. Saul had done something very evil when he was king. And the thing that he did that was evil is the people of Israel had made a covenant with the Gibeonites. Gibeonites had tricked them, and they made a treaty, they made a covenant that they would not attack the Gibeonite people. And that was a promise that Joshua had made during his reign. Saul just throws it all out the window, and when Saul becomes king, he does attack the Gibeonites, and he kills some of the Gibeonites, thus violating the peace treaty. Later on, when you read through 2 Samuel, there's a famine in the land. And so David wants to know, well, how do we fix this famine? Why is this famine occurring? Why is God punishing us with this famine? And it's explained that the reason why God is punishing you is because of the things that Saul did to the Gibeonites, and this has never been made right. So David goes to the Gibeonites and says, how can we make this right? We know that Saul, my predecessor, attacked you and killed some of your people. So how can we make this right? And the Gibeonites say, well, here's what we want. Saul has other sons. We want those other sons dead. And that's how we can make things right with one another. Two of those sons would be Rizpah's sons, who we're reintroduced to here in 2 Samuel chapter 21, who basically become casualties of war in 2 Samuel chapter 21. And so these two boys, along with 5 others, are killed. Not only are they killed, but the Gibeonites, I think, are probably sending a message because they want other people to know, don't mess with us or we'll punish you. And so they leave these dead bodies, after they've been impaled, they leave these dead bodies out in the open to rot, and they leave them there for 5 to 6 months. This happens at the beginning of barley harvest, and it continues in through the spring rains. So for 5 or 6 months, the 2 boys of this mom are left dead out in the open. David can't do anything about it because David made a promise that he would give up these boys, and so David doesn't want to mess with that treaty, at least for a time. And the Gibeonites want to leave the bodies there to send a message to Israel and everybody else that you will be punished if you violate the terms of your treaty with us. Who's in the midst of this collateral damage? It's Rizpah. Rizpah, who has lost Saul. Rizpah, who has lost Ishbosheth. Rizpah, who really doesn't have a husband or father figure to care for anymore. And now Rizpah has lost her 2 boys. And she's all alone. And look, this is what we find Rizpah doing when we come to 2 Samuel chapter 21. It says, Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, took sackcloth. These are the clothes of mourning. She's weeping, she's mourning, and she spread it for herself on the rock. From the beginning of harvest until the late rains poured on them from heaven, and she did not allow the birds of the air to rest on them by day, nor the beasts of the field by night. Can you imagine Rizpah? Awake all night long, awake all day, fighting off the vultures, fighting off the beasts with her torch, anything that would want to kind of come and land or gnaw or chew on her decomposing children. And here she is fighting them off and doing it for 5-6 months, bringing attention to the fact that her children have not been given a proper and dignified burial. In verse 11, David was told what Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, the concubine of Saul, had done. David finds out about it. And then David went and took the bones of Saul, the bones of Jonathan, his son, from the men of Jabesh Gilead, because they were still using those as trophies and prizes. And it says where the Philistines had hung them up after the Philistines had struck down Saul in Gilboa. And he brought up the bones of Saul and the bones of Jonathan, his son, from there. And they gathered the bones of those who had been hanged. That's Rizpah's sons, 5 others as well. And they buried the bones of Saul and Jonathan his son in the country of Benjamin and Zelah in the tomb of Kish his father. And they performed all that the king commanded. And after that, God heeded the prayer for the land. Do you notice that? After that, after David took care of those dead bodies in the way that God wanted them to be taken care of, in the way that Rizpah brings attention to, that's when God removed the curse from the land. What do we learn from Rizpah? Even though your children are gone, and even though they've died, a mother who loves her children, you don't ever forget about them. You want them to be treated and spoken of with dignity and with respect, even in death. And we find Rizpah as a beautiful picture of the protective nature of motherhood, not only when your children are alive, but even after they're gone. As you turn the pages into the New Testament, you see Jesus. You see him touched by the grief of the widow of Nain, raising her son to life again, almost like a picture of type and antitype of King David and King Jesus. Perhaps Jesus was thinking ahead to the grief that his own mother would face, because when you read John chapter 19 and verse 25, you read about another mother who's at the foot, this time of the cross, and that mother is Mary. In John chapter 19 and verse 25, while her son has been falsely accused, spat upon, betrayed, denied, treated with torture and cruelty. John 19 verse 25 says, there stood by the cross of Jesus his mother. Everybody else denied him. All these men were cowards who ran away even though they had professed their loyalty, but a mother doesn't ever give up on her children. And there stood by the cross of Jesus his mother and his mother's sister, Mary the wife of Clopas and Mary Magdalene, and Jesus saw his mother before he died. When mothers lose their children to sickness, to tragedy, to war, and even to suicide, the pain can be so acute, so incomparable, so unimaginable. In fact, the loss of a child is unlike other losses. It's been said, a wife who loses a husband, she's called a widow. A husband who loses a wife, he's called a widower. A child who loses his parents is called an orphan. There is no word for a parent who loses a child. That's how awful the loss is. So for some today, it's a hard day because it brings to mind a life that's been cut short. And so in our compassion, take a moment, scan the room and scan your mind and think about those who may be having a particularly difficult time today. And just notice them, like Jesus noticed the widow who lost her child, like Jesus noticed his own mother as she was at the foot of the cross, and look after them. Like Jesus tried to look after his own mother while he was on the cross. Don't act as if they're now gone, they're to be forgotten. Don't act as if we just have to move on. Keep the dignity of their memories alive, like Rizpah did day and night for her slain sons. Because there's a mother out there who still cares for them. Now, we've given a few situations that remind us of the pain and the grief and the suffering that we might bring to our mothers. And yet, I want you to see something from all this. This might feel like a little bit of a downer sermon today, but I want you to understand something. This is exactly why mothers should be celebrated. They endure so much for us, and they've endured so much from us sometimes. And their sacrifices from birth through life deserve to be honored and praise. Let me just finish with one final verse. What makes it all worthwhile, moms? Why do we do this for our children? 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 15 There's a lot of different takes on this verse, but I have a simple take on this verse, and some people might disagree with me. But in 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 15, it says this. It talks about Adam, it talks about Eve, and that's who we started with in this lesson. It talks about Adam being, of course, created first, and then Eve. It talks about also the fall order, Eve given into sin first, and then Adam. But verse 15 says, nevertheless, she will be saved in childbearing. She, that's the mother of children. She will be saved in childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with self-control. What makes it all worthwhile, moms? Well, I think verse 15 just is simply saying, what makes it all worthwhile to give birth to children, to raise children, to rear children, to make the sacrifices that we make to raise our children? What makes it all worthwhile is seeing their souls saved for all of eternity as they continue in faith, in love, and holiness. This is how John would put it. And I know that John is speaking of his children in a figurative sense, but if it's true in the figurative sense, it's true in the literal sense as well. But in 2 John verse 4, this is what John says, I rejoice greatly that I have found some of your children walking in truth. What makes it all worthwhile raising our children? When we see them walking in truth. And so I'd conclude with this final thought. The greatest gift that mothers can give to our children, the greatest hope that we can offer them, the greatest treasure that parents could ever give you, it's not an education, it's not money, it's not athletic ability, and it's not just happy memories. Each of these things, it's going to fade. You're going to leave it behind one day. The greatest gift your mother could ever give you is to share with you the great hope that we can all have in Jesus, because it is the greatest of educations, the greatest of riches, the greatest of futures. So if you had a mother who sang to you about Jesus, who read to you about Jesus, who speaks to you about Jesus, you are one of the richest children, one of the richest children in all the world. And if you're falling short of the treasures that are found in Jesus, you're not just grieving your mother, you are grieving the God who gave you his son so that you could be forgiven of your past foolishness and so you could live with a purpose and in real hope. If you've not laid hold of the hope that we can all have in Jesus, then I would invite you to come and join the greatest family that you'll ever share by being born again. You're born by your mother the first time. You can be born again through the Spirit a second time as you're buried into the waters of baptism, coming up to start a new life in the family of Jesus. If you haven't done that yet, or somehow you've fallen short and you've been failing, we're going to invite you to make things right with the Lord. While together we stand while we sing.